Today we have a guest who is visiting us here for some time. His name is Dr. Albert Pessarrodona. He's from the University of Western Australia. I don't know why he's here. I don't really know who he is, so I asked him politely to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he's doing here at the Institute before he will continue on his lecture, which is Can Kelp Forests Sequester Carbon in Warming World? A very interesting topic. So, yeah, just a reminder, this is being recorded and will be used against you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Hello, everyone. I'm Albert. Yeah, as the introduction was saying, I'm from the University of Western Australia. I'm a research fellow there. And what we've been doing here is we've just been working with Carl and Lilia. Our research has to do with kelp forests, so we're just working with these guys to try to understand a bit better what's going on with the kelp forest in Iceland. So we just came, I think, a week ago or so, and we're going to stay for another week, just going up and down the coast, sampling some kelp forest and looking at the standing biomass and the sea urchins and stuff like that. So as I was saying, the research of our group has to do with this ecosystem, kelp forest, which is one of the prettiest ecosystems, in my opinion, and not biased at all. And really our research has to do or tries to understand what's the role of these ecosystems in the coastal ocean. And to try to understand this role, really the first thing that you need to know is where do you find these ecosystems, right? So we know that we find kelp forests from the shallows, sort of intertidal, all the way down to like 60, 70 meters. But a few years ago, we did this work where we tried to estimate what's the global extent of this ecosystem. And the results were a bit shocking. So it came out that, we did some modeling work, and it came out that these ecosystems occupy around 6 million kilometers squared, which, if that number doesn't mean anything to you, you're not alone. It's around twice the size of the area of India. But when we did this modeling exercise, of course, we know that all models are wrong, and some are useful, no? And we were getting some strange predictions, right? So some predictions like, the model was predicting that there was suitable habitat for these seaweed or kelp forests down here in Antarctica. And the reason why that is weird is just because we thought that kelps couldn't grow in those conditions that far south, and of course we couldn't go. So this is just the area that the model was predicting. Of course we couldn't go there and check it out. But you'll imagine how happy I was a few years later when I saw that this paper where they were doing taking photographs and doing some scanning of the seabed around exactly that area, and then they found this. So it turns out that in that case that the model predictions were correct. So really, these ecosystems are truly extensive, right? They're the largest coastal vegetated habitat that we have. Just to give you a sense of, I put a video here, of course, risking that it wouldn't work, but anyway, yeah. Videos and presentations don't go together. This was just showing you how in some places, this forest can really be extensive, just like you would find it on land. So then, as I said, the goal of our research group is to try to understand the role of these kelp forests and what kelp forests do in the coastal ocean. And we have known, obviously, for a long time that these function in similar ways than terrestrial forests. As they grow, they take up CO2 from the surrounding water. And we have known for a long time that some species can grow really fast. They are amongst the fastest plants growing on the planet. So some plants can grow, I think, around 10 centimeters a day, but we didn't know if that is the same everywhere, right? So we really wanted to know, same in sort of around the world, how fast are these kelp forests growing and how much CO2 are they taking up. So if you were a phytoplankton ecologist, you would just use some satellite data, right? So remote sensing. But what's happening in these sort of coastal areas where these kelp forests grow is that, you know, the readings of the satellites really don't do that very well. So this graph here is just showing you this model mismatch of the satellite remote sensing. And as you can see, as you approach sort of shallower depths, you know, there's a bigger mismatch, just showing that, you know, this remote sensing approaches don't do that well in these coastal waters. So what we had to do to try to figure out how much growth and how much carbon are these kelp forests fixing is do a different approach. So we collated a global database of published carbon fixation rates. This was pretty expansive, you know, around 250 species from 400 sites around the world, distributed across pretty much the entire depth gradient where you find these forests. And then our approach was the following. So essentially we related those carbon fixation rates to environmental variables of that given location where the data was collected, right? So then we try to derive a relationship between those environmental conditions. Then once we had that relationship, we were able to extrapolate that carbon fixation based on, you know, the globally available environmental layers, and that kind of like was the result. So we were able to predict this carbon fixation of these forests at the global scale, and this is sort of what it looks like. So here, the points are the raw data, and then all the rest is just the model prediction. So as you can see, you know, it does more or less a good job. But I guess the take home here is that, you know, two take homes. It varies quite a lot depending on where you are in the forest, but also that the carbon fixation rates can actually be pretty high, you know, around 4 to 5 kilos of carbon per year, which is very high, which is, I guess, what I'm trying to show here. So again, two interesting things. When you plot the carbon fixation rate of these kelp forests and you compare them with other primary producers, you see that you know, they don't follow the same latitudinal trend as the other ecosystems. So the highest carbon fixation of these kelp forests is actually happening in temperate latitudes, such around here. And the carbon fixation rates can be per meter square, can be really high, you know, compared to others, to, as I said, up to 4 to 5 kilos. What is also interesting in terms of understanding what does that mean for the coastal ocean is that here, then we just plotted what is, you know, how does that productivity compare with phytoplankton, coastal phytoplankton productivity per area of meter square, right? So the more right it is, then the more, so that means, you know, up to 10 times the kelp productivity is 10 times bigger than the phytoplankton productivity. So as you can see here, what is interesting is that there is a clear pattern where, you know, this is suggesting that the productivity of this kelp forest is becoming more important for carbon fixation as you go up towards Arctic and subarctic latitudes, right? So then combining those sort of estimates with our estimates of where these forests are found, we found out that, you know, all up, these kelp forests are taking around 1.3 petagrams, or they're fixing 1.3 petagrams of carbon per year, which again, if that number doesn't mean anything to you, you're not alone. That's around the same quantity as the boreal forest of Canada. So it's quite big. And then following from that work, our sort of question was, okay, what is happening with all this carbon that gets fixed, right? So we know that for a long time as well, you know, things like sea urchins and other type of grazers can consume that carbon that is getting fixed in the kelp forest. But recently as well, as in some of the work, that was coming out from Norway, where we also work in the Institute of Marine Research. We are finding that some of these kelp fragments were ending up in these video transects that we were doing in the seabed, right? So this is just an image here from a fjord that is around 400 to 500 meters depth. And then when when you look in the literature, it turns out that those reports are actually quite widespread. So here it's just showing you reports of sort of like kelp fragments or seaweed fragments that have been found in the deep sea, right? So these will be from like drop cameras or like ROVs or like submarine dives and so on. So this is just a report. So as you can see, though, it's pretty widespread around the world, right? And this really begs the question whether some of that carbon that is being found in these great ocean depths can be considered sequestered, just as the same carbon that comes from phytoplankton, right? So this was really begging the question to see whether those kelp forests can be considered this thing that is now famous, that is called blue carbon, right? Which refers to the carbon that is sequestered by coastal marine vegetated habitats, right? So the reason why there's a lot of interest in this blue carbon is, I guess, twofold. So as you know, we are in this world where we're trying to limit warming to around 1.5, which is most certainly not going to happen to 2 degrees, right? And to do that, we need to do 3 things. We need to reduce emissions, we need to preserve and increase whatever natural capacity the Earth's ecosystems have to absorb carbon. And we're probably at a point as well where the threshold has been exceeded, and we actually need to start artificially sequestering carbon back down from the atmosphere. So blue carbon really plays a role in those two, right? And the reason why I guess it's important is because the actions around those ecosystems that enhance the natural capacity to sequester carbon can lead to sizable removal, right? So around 3% of the global emissions. But importantly as well, a lot of those emissions are this thing that they're calling cost effective, right? So this graph here is just showing you different types of actions that you can take and how much mitigation potential are you getting, right? So then in the darker colors where is being plotted what is the low cost portion. So as you can see, avoiding coastal impacts is in this sort of like low cost category. So meaning, avoiding the destruction of these ecosystems that are preserving, storing and sequestering carbon is a low cost way to not fuck things up, essentially. So really kelp and seaweed are coming in as this thing that some people are calling these emerging blue carbon ecosystems, where we're still trying to do some research to establish whether and how much these ecosystems are sequestering. Other systems that people are working on is just unvegetated ocean sediments or things like coastal mudflats. But in recent times, there has really been an increase in or a surge in interest in understanding whether these kelp forests can sequester carbon. This graph is just showing you the number of publications in a recent review that we did, just to track, I guess, the interest in the scientific literature, but also, there's a lot of interest as well in the public and sort of industry domain. So there's a bunch of companies that are trying to grow some of these seaweeds to see if they can sequester carbon, and you can find all these crazy things from like robots that are meant to take up these floating seaweeds and bring it down to the deep sea, to like these crazy floating seaweed farms. So this sequestration, this is always a tricky graph to explain, but this sequestration essentially, unlike the other blue carbon ecosystems, things like eelgrass or mangroves, where most of the sequestration happens inside the same habitat, right, in those sediments that these ecosystems are growing on. What is different about seaweed and kelp ecosystems is that most of the sequestration happens outside of that habitat, and this is, I guess, what this is trying to show. This is trying to show the pathways that can lead to this sequestration, right? So you have that as they grow, the kelps are taking on CO2, and then some of that carbon that gets fixed onto the plant may get either consumed or grazed in the ecosystem, but then some of it, then whatever is left, can be exported as detritus outside that ecosystem. So that can go into other blue carbon habitats like seagrass meadows, or then it can get exported, if given the right conditions, can get exported to the deep sea. So the challenge here is, trying to quantify and verify this. And I guess the big challenge that we're having is that in this case, since the carbon is not carbon sequestration is not happening in the same ecosystem, it's happening in the open ocean, right? You really need to understand what's going on with the ocean current. So you really need to combine a huge different areas of expertise, I guess. So we have a group of different experts that are trying to all collaborate and to try to answer those questions. So the first thing that we did, again, was kind of like try to look at the global scale. So then using these global oceanographic models and all the estimates that we had done before of where you find these kelp forests and how much carbon they are fixing, then we were able to estimate that across the global ocean, they're contributing to around 3 to 4% of this ocean carbon sink, just this transport of kelp from the shallows where the kelp forests grow to these deeper areas. And this doesn't sound like much, but when you realize that this is something that hasn't been accounted for, I think it is pretty significant. So now what we're trying to do now is, this was kind of like the first step, if you will, and just looking at this really sort of coarse global scale, right, to try to understand in which regions some of this sequestration may be more important than others. But what we're trying to do now is just sort of like zoom in several of these regions and try to validate those global scale models with sort of finer resolution models. And this is kind of like how it looks. So this is an example from Western Australia here, and all those little dots are essentially simulating little kelp particles that are getting released from where these kelp forests are growing. And as you can see, they just get sort of transported up and down with the currents, and then once they cross this critical depth threshold, are turning green. So from that work, we obtained similar estimates actually than the global scale model, which is promising. And here I put another video, but of course it's not gonna. Oh yeah, this one worked for some reason. So this is another example from Patagonia in Chile. So sort of the step that we're at now is just working with a bunch of collaborators around the globe that have similar interests to try to sort of tackle this and look at this finer scale resolution, really to understand whether this is actually happening or not. Okay, and so what are we doing here, I guess? So, in all those exercises, we realized that these kelp forests that are found sort of in these high latitudes are also very extensive. They can also be very pretty. And we know that these, kelp forests around the globe in generally are changing really rapidly, right? Especially in response to warming, but especially in this high latitude is where we're expecting to see very big changes. No? So we're expecting a really big expansion of this kelp forest in the Arctic as the ice sort of goes away and there's increases in light. We expect some of these habitats to be able to colonize further north. So this is just an example here for some global predictive modeling. But it does seem like this is already happening, no? So in this other work, they looked at examples in the literature where either expansions or increases in abundance, no changes or declines have been documented in these sort of high latitude regions. So when there is an increase is in green, when there's no change is in black, and when there's a decline is in red. So as you can see, there's a lot of green in the map here. So we know that this is happening, right? So really what we are trying to understand is, okay, how is this expansion going to affect sort of the amount that these kelp forests, the amount of carbon, that these kelp forests are cycling. So we know from, in these high latitude regions, we know from the literature that things like, the amount of ice in the water is very important. So in places like Greenland, essentially the amount of ice-free days that you have as a proxy of light really drives the productivity of how big these kelps can grow. So as you can see, the more open water days that you have, the bigger the kelps can get and the more carbon they can fix. But there's a big chunk of these high latitude regions, places like Iceland or the Norwegian coastline where we work, that those coastlines are really not that affected by this sea ice. So it is also really important to understand what's going to happen in those, right? And we know that in those coastlines as well, we are expecting major changes. So for example, this is just showing a major distributional shift that we're expecting with one of these dominant kelp species. So what we have been doing so far is working along these latitudinal gradients in ocean temperature. So this is just an example from Norway, where we worked from the south of Norway, where it's relatively warm, all the way up to Svalbard in the Arctic. And then we try to understand how these gradients in ocean temperature are shaping the productivity of these kelp forests. And the neat thing about some of these kelp plants is that you can really track very well how much they have grown. So this is one of the main species that you find here in Iceland, and that is also very common in Norway. So this bit here is just this year's growth, whereas that bit here is the last year's growth. So we know that if we go to these places, and that's just because most of the growth happens sort of like between December and end of May. So we know that when we go to these places by the end of May, most of the yearly growth that is going to happen that year has already happened. So that is very convenient for us because we can just go there, measure that amount of growth, and then we know how much these plants have grown for a year. And that's essentially what this graph is trying to show. So then, the question that we're asking is, along these locations, how is that growth changing, right? And also the other neat thing about these plants is that you can, just like trees as well, you can sort of cut them and you can age them and know how old they are, right? So then, we look at things like this. So this graph is just showing how much growth is happening across the age distribution, right, of these plants in all these different locations. So, this is to the south, and then this is to the north. So you can see that, for example, for this species, in the south of Norway, you get only up to 7 years old, more or less, and then, when you compare it with the other locations, you're getting less. Per a given year, you're getting less big plants or less growth, right? So they are struggling more to growth compared to other places. So then we can expect that in those locations, then with further warming, there are going to be further decreases. Whereas, in sort of like mid Norway or, towards the northern bit of Norway, then these plants are growing very well. So if you look here at places like Porsanger or Finnøy, the plant not only get older, but also, they can get bigger just because the conditions are better for their growth. And this varies a little bit depending on the species that you are looking at, and depending on the distribution of that species, right? So this is thing like Alaria here. We only have 2 sites, but Porsanger, which is sort of more south than Svalbard, that the plants are growing better. But what is interesting is that in places like the high Arctic, the plants can grow and get really, really old, whereas in the other places they tend to only reach certain ages and be younger. And then this is another example from a different plant where you get again a different pattern, sort of similar story. Really, in the south of Norway, in Arendal, there's not much growth, whereas in sort of western Norway, here in green, the plants can grow bigger compared to the south or the north in Arendal. But again, similar story here. The plants in the high Arctic can get really old. Okay, so what does all this mean? Can we get some sort of predictive relationship using all this data? So I guess that's what we're trying to do here. And I should say all of this is still very preliminary, but yeah, so this graph here is just showing you what is the productivity of, or the average productivity of these kelp plants across all these sites that we have sampled, right? And in the bottom axis is showing how different is the temperature respective of the sort of optimal temperature of this species. So the more we go to that site, the more stressful the conditions or the temperature is for those species, right? So what is interesting is that it does look like there's quite an interesting relationship between, what is the maximum local temperature that a site experiences and relative to the affinity of that species, right? What is interesting is that I guess this relationship only holds for when you look at things like maximum temperature. If I just plot here what is just the average temperature at that site, that doesn't have such a clear pattern. Here I just plotted a bunch of different species, but as you can see, there's not really much pattern. And when we look at, this is just per plant, right? How big a plant can grow in all these different places. But then we also look at, when you at the sort of reef or kelp forest level, and when we take into account the density of those plants, right? Not only how much they're growing, the plant, but how abundant they are, then we get things like this. So this is just showing the total productivity of the kelp forest across all these different sites. So again, sort of left is south, right is north, and as you can see, the productivity kind of like peaks in mid-western Norway. But what is interesting is that the contribution of the different, what is contributing to that productivity varies a lot as well, right? So you can see here that in the high Arctic, there's other species contributing to that productivity. And what is striking to me here as well is that we were not expecting the productivity to be so high in these high Arctic places, right? So this is part of what I guess what we're doing here in Iceland is trying to see, the plants here follow similar patterns. So kind of like the take homes for this is that, this Arctic forest can actually be pretty productive, more than we thought. But, especially in these really high Arctic places, that productivity is unique and, is contributed by all these unique species that you don't find anywhere else in many cases, right? So, this work is also suggesting that warming is likely going to increase the productivity. But that means that, for those very unique species that may decline, even though the productivity may be maintained, we're going to lose these very unique species. And kind of like the next step for this work is trying to understand, what's going to happen to the grazer side of the equation, right? Who's going to consume this productivity and how much is getting consumed now and how much is gonna get consumed in the future. So looking at things like sea urchins is gonna be very important. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for attending, and thanks all the collaborators and all the funders of this work. And thank you for having. I have to say, I think, we have traveled a fair bit, and I don't think we ever worked with so accommodating and welcoming people, not only in the institute but also just in general. So we're really having a good time in Iceland, and thank you for having us.
Thank you. We have some questions.
Hello.
Thank you for this interesting talk. Maybe a silly question. Okay, maybe a silly question. I'm just wondering, how do the kelps have age rings like trees?
Yes.
Okay.
If you go in the lab, we can show you later. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly how we age them. Yeah. So essentially, it's the same. The darker bits are just usually in that period where they're not growing, whereas around December to May, where they're growing really fast, that's just what creates the lighter bit.
More questions and online as well, if we have. Yep.
I have a question about what are the sort of inhibiting factors in the growth of these kelp forests?
Yeah.
What I have in mind is this increased agricultural runoff, nutrients. Are you looking into that, especially since this is a coastal phenomenon?
Yeah. Yeah, that is very important in some places. So we know that specifically for this Arctic project, we are not expecting increases everywhere, because in many of the Arctic coastlands you are getting a lot of increased runoff from the melting of the glaciers. Whereas in other systems where that is not so important, then that's where we're expecting most of the increases. But yeah, that's a very important factor to consider. Yeah.
Questions? I have. You talk about sea urchins in the end.
Yeah.
As the other part of the equation.
Uh-huh.
But also, I mean, we have harvest.
Right.
Of kelps.
Yeah.
Is that important? Is it in such a scale that it doesn't really matter, or where are we with that?
Well, I think here in Iceland there's only a little bit of harvesting happening in the intertidal, but some of these kelps really get harvested in places like Norway and so on. And we know that if you allow them to grow, I think it's every 5 years, then most of the kelp forest comes back. So if you manage well the harvesting, it has a somewhat limited effect. But yeah, obviously that's also important to consider.
Yeah. Okay. Peter, just speak up. If you have a question.
Oh,
I'm at the unit.
she's muted, I think.
So I think the question was on your project here in Iceland. Was it correct, Einar? You appeared and then you disappeared with the question. Sorry, Einar. What is the project here in Iceland? What locations are you looking at? And yeah.
Right. Yeah, so far we've been working just around sort of Reykjavik and the peninsula here. And as I said, yeah, we're just trying to, we're sampling essentially these kelp plants at different depths to see how the growth is varying across the different depths. So essentially that involves just going, diving, putting quadrats, harvesting a bunch of different plants, and then we do in the lab, we age them, we weigh them, and we look at that new blade growth just to see how much they have grown this season. So that's what we've been doing so far, just going to all these places and collecting at different depths. So we're hoping to go to maybe like 6 to 8 locations all up just around here in the peninsula. And then we're also looking at how many sea urchins are at those different depths and how much of that kelp productivity they may be eating.
You had another question on cowboys.
Cowboys, all right.
And carbon cowboys, and do you think they will start harvesting sea urchins?
Yeah, well, the carbon cowboys, is kind of like an issue that is hard to escape. And there's certainly already some companies trying to, use seaweed and kelp to claim carbon credits. Where, I would say, especially in some of the proposals that they're proposing, the science is still not there. But I guess it's just hard to know what to do. I guess in those cases, that's kind of like it's just the economic market, I think, that drives those things popping up. But certainly a thing.
I have more questions. Do you have questions?
I can just a comment to the carbon cowboy thing. There are projects, actually existing projects in Norway that I'm aware of, and probably also elsewhere, where harvesting urchins is the main mechanism for regrowing the kelp forest and claiming carbon credits or some level of credit. Now, I'm not sure that they have actually done all of the calculations, because what they do is they take the urchins and then they take the gonads out, the roe out, and fly it to Japan for the markets there. And I don't think the carbon balance in that is particularly good. But it's being looked at as an option.
Maybe I just have a comment on that, and we have also been approached by the Norwegians or Lilja and others, to evaluate kind of the nature-based solutions they are kind of suggesting there. One is to kind of just to eradicate the sea urchins, and other is to increase the the wolfish populations, to repopulate the wolfish in those areas, and they seem a little bit difficult, how to manage. We have a small-scale fisheries of sea urchins here in Iceland, and the market for those producers is predominantly France. It's not a big market, but there is a market for them, and it's always difficult to see, how this balance, because we have seen, we have seen areas here, where the kelp forest has disappeared in Iceland because of grazing of sea urchins, but it's difficult where to, step into this balance, but there may be a small-scale harvest, alongside kind of, would be maybe acceptable, so what is actually, what we are practicing here in Iceland, but if there is an incentive of, of fishing them, other than, selling them, and then this is a slightly different equation, if you're getting paid just for killing them, that's, and why are they the bad guys, who is to decide,
You would have to kill an awful lot for it to make an actual difference. And another issue is that is often overlooked in this conversation is that the urchins that are of high value are not the ones that are causing the problems mostly, because the ones that have big fat gonads sit in the kelp forest and eat drift and so on. They're not the ones that have mowed down everything where you have massive densities preventing the regrowth of the kelp forest. What they actually have to do is they have to collect those urchins and feed them up before they can sell them. So there's a little bit of a mismatch between where the problem is and what the resource is, and I think there's definitely room for urchin fishing if you ask me, but it's not as simple as let's just go where there's lots of urchins and pull them out and send them off, because it doesn't work like that. You need to feed them up first, in some cases at least. I mean, some of the urchins we've looked at out here have virtually no gonads at all, because they're so starved out in the slightly deeper water where there's no kelp.
Related to that, sea urchins, are they selective on species of kelps, or are they just generalists and just eat whatever?
They're pretty generalist, I would say. They can survive with eating nothing pretty much, but I guess we'll tell you in a few weeks once we're doing a trial now as well, just to see if they prefer certain species of kelp.
And just for the 5-year-olds, how would a new species arrive in Iceland in terms of kelps? Are they coming here with just ocean currents, or?
Mm.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
And how likely is it that we get new species following these warming periods?
For Iceland in particular, I think I'm not too sure if there's predictions to get new species. I think the main change will be, as those environmental conditions shift, there's expected to be major changes in how fast they can grow.
The local species.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. First mistake of the. Are there any more questions? I've asked all my questions.
Perfect.
No,
Well, thanks again for having us.